5:52 a.m. East 116th Street, Cleveland, Ohio. The porch light of a narrow 1908 row house clicked off automatically at 5:45, the way it did every morning. 7 minutes later, a 12-man entry team in federal tactical gear stacked against the front wall, 2 deep, pressed into the shadow of the brick facade. The sergeant at the front held a ballistic shield in one hand and a baton in the other. He had not yet used either. At 5:52 exactly, a flash bang sailed through the parlor window. The concussion shook loose a century of dust from the eaves. Before the ringing had faded inside the house, the door came off its hinges. The team moved through the smoke in a practiced line, clearing rooms left to right, calling out each space as it went empty. Ground floor, clear. Upper floor, clear. Basement door, locked. 38 days earlier, 8 people had walked into this building. Not one of them had walked back out. This is the reconstruction of how a single wrong detail, noticed by a man with no badge, no warrant, and no federal authority, cracked open the largest single-address firearms recovery on Cleveland's East Side in 11 years, and ended 38 days of absolute silence for 8 adults whose families had stopped sleeping. The man who noticed the detail was not supposed to be there at all. His name, for this account, is Ray Kowalski, 51 years old. Laid off from his pipe-fitting crew in November of 2025, when the Cuyahoga County infrastructure contract his union local had been counting on got pushed 18 months into the future by a budget delay, nobody explained properly to anybody. He'd been renting a room in a duplex on the Buckeye Shaker border since January of 2026, month to month, paying $840 cash while he waited for the union hall to call his name back up on the list. He was practical about his situation. He wasn't happy about it, but he was practical. What he was not practical about was anomalies. 26 years of pipe fitting teaches a person to read systems. Pressure, flow, heat exchange, structural stress. Your eyes start doing it automatically. You look at a pipe the way a doctor looks at a wrist, not admiringly, just reading. On a Wednesday morning in early July of 2026, Ray Kowalski put his hand on a chimney breast and noticed that it was cold. Not cool. Cold. A deep, ambient cold, the kind that doesn't come from shade. The outdoor temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees by 9 in the morning, and the interior of the duplex, which ran on one window unit that struggled badly, was pushing 85. The chimney breast in the front parlor was made of old brick, a full-height column running floor to ceiling in the corner of the room. He'd leaned against it once and noticed the temperature, then dismissed it. That Wednesday, he pressed both palms flat against the face of it and held them there for 15 seconds. The brick was at least 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding wall. He looked up at the ceiling. The wood stove flue that should have connected to the chimney had been capped off at the ceiling, plastered over, painted. He walked out to the sidewalk and looked at the roofline. The chimney stack that projected above the gutter was capped with a concrete cap, the kind you put on a decommissioned flue to keep weather out. No smoke. No draft. No thermal exchange with the outside. A sealed chimney, capped at top and bottom, exposed to 90-degree heat for 3 months, should have been warm to the touch. It should have been acting as a passive solar collector inside a brick shell. It was not warm. It was actively cold. Ray Kowalski went back inside. He knocked on the brick with his knuckle, low, then middle, then high. He was listening for what a pipe fitter listens for: differential resonance, the sound that tells you what's behind a wall. What he heard was not the dense, muffled thump of solid brick backed by plaster and lath. What he heard was hollow. He stood in the parlor for a long time after that. He was not a law enforcement officer. He had no legal standing to open anything. He went back to his room, made coffee, and thought about it for 3 days. In those 3 days, he made a point of sitting in the front parlor at different times: morning, afternoon, late evening. He told himself he was just going about his normal routine, but his eyes kept returning to the shared wall and the capped rooftop visible through the window. The property in question was a full standalone row house, but the two structures were set close enough that on quiet evenings he could hear conversations on the neighboring stoop. In 6 months of renting the room, he could not recall hearing a single sound from the row house's interior. Not a television. Not footsteps on hardwood. Not the ambient cycling hum of a refrigerator. He thought about that more than he expected to. Silence in a residential structure is not, by itself, unusual. Vacant buildings are silent. But vacant buildings in a Cleveland summer don't generate the kind of cold he'd felt pressing against his palms. He found himself returning to it at odd moments, while eating, while trying to sleep, while standing in line at the pharmacy on Buckeye Road. He was not an excitable person. He had run crews for over 2 decades. He knew the difference between a hunch and something that required an explanation. What he had was something closer to the latter, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. The Union Hall food drive ran every other Saturday morning out of a church basement on Kinsman Road. Ray showed up for it partly because he needed the help, and partly because he liked having somewhere to be. Behind the coffee urn that Saturday was a man in his late 60s who wore a plaid flannel shirt and poured coffee with the economy of motion of someone who had done many things for a long time. His name, for this account, is Dennis Farrell. Retired. 22 years as an armorer and technical specialist with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the last 7 of them out of the ATF Cleveland Field Division. Ray did not know any of that. He just needed someone to talk to about a chimney. He described what he'd found. The cold brick. The hollow knock. The capped flue. The sealed rooftop. He was not dramatic about it. He laid it out like a maintenance report. Farrell poured 2 cups and listened without interrupting. When Ray finished, Farrell asked one question. How long had the house been like that? Ray said he'd been renting there since January, and he wasn't sure about before. Farrell handed him his coffee and said he'd make a call. He did not elaborate further. He did not ask Ray for his last name or a callback number. Ray had given his full name and address when he signed in at the food bank intake desk, the way everyone did: name, phone, zip. And Farrell, who had spent 22 years handling sensitive information through official channels, understood that a tip moved cleanest when it arrived at the federal intake system without a long chain of civilian-to-civilian handoffs blurring the provenance. He folded the paper napkin he'd been using to wipe down the edge of the coffee urn, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and went back to pouring for the next person in line. The conversation had taken 9 minutes. 48 hours later, that call had reached the FBI Cleveland field office. The initial tip was logged into the federal tip management system at 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in mid-July of 2026. The logging time was automatic. Farrell had submitted it through a secure online portal that timestamps on receipt. The summary was 3 paragraphs. Anomalous thermal signature in a sealed chimney structure in a residential duplex, Buckeye Shaker area, Cleveland East Side. Possible concealed void. Source: direct observation by a civilian with professional construction background. 3 paragraphs. 4:17 a.m. 48 hours from a food drive to a federal log entry. The agent who pulled the tip the following morning was a task force coordinator attached to a joint FBI Cleveland PD operation that had been quietly building a RICO case against a Kinsman area street crew since March of 2026. Her name, for this account, is Special Agent Carla Dempsey. She had been working the Kinsman file for 4 months. She had surveillance logs, financial intercepts, and a utility record anomaly she had not yet been able to explain. The Kinsman crew the task force had been building toward was not, by any street taxonomy, a household name on Cleveland's East Side. That was part of what had made the investigation slow. The organizational structure was horizontal enough, no single commanding figure visible at an obvious apex, that traditional RICO pattern mapping was taking longer than it would have with a more vertically organized enterprise. There was an identifiable logistics layer, visible in vehicle patterns and a rotation schedule for storage drops that the task force had partially mapped. There was a collection layer, made up of individuals who moved through specific corridors on specific days, in ways that surveillance had documented without yet producing a legally actionable link to the top of the organization. And there was the financial layer, the LLC structure, the layered corporate shells, the cash-intensive retail fronts, which is where federal prosecutors most wanted to land, because the financial layer is where criminal enterprises become prosecutable beyond the individuals who do the physical work. Dempsey had been building toward that layer for 4 months. Ray Kowalski's tip gave her a physical address to anchor it to. The anomaly was this: a duplex on East 116th Street, owned through a limited liability company that also held title to a corner beauty supply store and a shuttered barbershop 2 blocks away, was drawing 900 kilowatt-hours of electricity per month. The LLC's registered agent had filed a vacancy declaration with the city in February. The property was officially unoccupied. 900 kilowatt-hours a month is not what an empty building draws. A vacant 1908 row house with no active appliances, no HVAC, no tenants on record pulls, maybe 40 to 60 kilowatt-hours in standby losses from a single outdoor security lamp. 900 kilowatt-hours is what you draw when you are running refrigeration equipment, or climate control for a sealed interior space, or both. Agent Dempsey had flagged that number in April. She had not yet connected it to a physical structure feature. Ray Kowalski's tip connected it for her. She read the tip 3 times. Then she pulled the property records for the LLC, the beauty supply, the barbershop, the duplex, all 3 acquired between September and December of 2025, all paid through the LLC's registered address, a mail forwarding service in Beechwood. The manager of record was listed as a holding company incorporated in Delaware. Standard layering. 3 shells deep before you hit a natural person. Dempsey had already begun peeling those shells as part of the RICO work. She knew what crew the property was connected to. She had a theory about what the building was being used for. She had not had a physical anomaly to justify an expanded surveillance package. Now she had one. She submitted a request for a pole camera installation the same afternoon. What strikes us about this case, looked at from the outside, is how long the chimney had already been standing there. The void in that brick shell had almost certainly been constructed sometime in the fall of 2025, concurrent with the LLC's acquisition of the property. 7 months. The structure sat in plain view on a residential street, and nobody who walked past it, nobody who filed a utilities complaint, nobody who processed the vacancy declaration had any reason to look twice at a cold chimney on a hot day. It took a man trained by 26 years of work to notice that brick does not behave that way. The Bureau bolted a pole camera to a lamppost across the street from the duplex on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the tip was logged. The camera fed encrypted to a monitor in a field office conference room. An analyst ran the footage in real time during business hours and reviewed overnight batches each morning. The first 72 hours of footage showed almost nothing. A vehicle, a black Chevrolet Tahoe with commercial-grade window tint, parked in the rear gangway for 40 minutes on Friday evening, then left. No plates visible from the camera angle. A man in a gray hoodie entered through the back door at 11:41 p.m. on Saturday. He exited 23 minutes later, carrying a soft-sided duffel that appeared, by its shape and the way he carried it, to be heavy and rigid-packed. 23 minutes. In and out. No lights turned on in the building during that window. The analyst flagged both events and logged them with timestamps. On day 5 of the surveillance window, a different vehicle appeared. A white panel van with a magnetic sign advertising a heating and cooling company pulled into the rear gangway at 2 in the afternoon and stayed for 47 minutes. No tools were visible from the camera angle. No utility work was performed on the exterior. The analyst cross-referenced the company name against the Ohio Secretary of State's business registration database. The company existed. It had been registered 11 months earlier, its principal address, a residential house in Garfield Heights. Its sole officer was a name that cross-matched a prior state-level weapons charge, reduced at plea to disorderly conduct in 2024, against a known associate of the Kinsman crew. The van's registration number, captured by the pole camera on a separate frame, traced to the same LLC that held title to the duplex. A vehicle registered to a property's owner visiting that property is not, by itself, suspicious. A vehicle registered to the property's owner, bearing a commercial service sign that links to a recently formed company whose officer has a weapons history and a documented connection to the crew under investigation, parking for 47 minutes at an officially vacant building in the middle of a working afternoon. That is something the analyst is obligated to flag. The notation went into the surveillance log at day 5. It was incorporated into the affidavit package the following Monday. On day 9 of the pole camera operation, a K-9 unit conducted what was filed as a routine narcotics pass on the rear gangway during a neighborhood walk. The dog, a Belgian Malinois working with a Cleveland PD handler, sat down at the back door of the duplex and did not move until the handler released her. A K-9 alert does not, by itself, establish probable cause for a dwelling search. It establishes that something the dog was trained to find is present or has been present at that location. The alert was logged. It was added to the affidavit package that Agent Dempsey's supervisor had already begun assembling for a federal search warrant. Here's something about this case that cuts against the way these operations are usually described. Every piece of the probable cause package, the utility anomaly, the thermal signature, the pole camera footage, the K-9 alert, came together in under 3 weeks from a retired ATF armorer pouring coffee at a food drive. The federal apparatus did not find this property on its own. A laid-off pipefitter found it and handed it over. The apparatus then moved with remarkable efficiency once it had a target. But the target came from outside. That matters because it says something about what these networks count on, not invisibility exactly, but the ordinary human tendency not to lean on a cold brick and wonder why. The warrant application ran to 41 pages. It was submitted to a federal magistrate judge on a Monday afternoon. The judge signed it the following morning at 8:53 a.m. The entry was authorized for any time of day, given the documented security risk to persons believed to be present in the structure. The phrase, "persons believed to be present in the structure," was not bureaucratic padding. In the course of the RICO investigation, federal surveillance had picked up a fragment of a phone call, intercepted under a previously authorized wire, in which a voice described a transaction that had gone badly. The phrase used, translated from a mix of street slang and Spanish, referred to people being held as guarantee against a debt. The intercept was dated 37 days before the raid. The debt referenced was for a heroin re-up that had been shorted, the shortfall blamed on the receiving end, the people held as collateral until the balance was settled. 8 people, held in a locked storage room in the sealed basement of a building, where the electricity bill told you something was running continuously. The warrant language covered the recovery of persons as well as contraband and firearms. The entry team assembled at a staging point 4 blocks away at 4:30 a.m. on a Wednesday. 12 agents and officers, 6 from the FBI Cleveland field office, 4 from Cleveland PD's Gang Crimes Unit, and 2 from the ATF. The operation commander briefed the stack in a parking lot using a floor plan pulled from city building records, filed when the structure had last been renovated in 1988. He noted, before they left the staging point, that the building records were nearly 40 years old and that the interior configuration might not match. The team was to treat the structure as unknown past the threshold. Each member of the team had been briefed individually and then collectively in the preceding 24 hours, a double-layer protocol applied to operations where civilian presence inside the target structure is confirmed or probable. The individual briefings covered the specific role assignments within the stack: who held the shield, who carried the ram, who managed the detainee processing on the street once subjects were walked out. The collective briefing covered the floor plan, with explicit notation of every point where the 1988 building record might diverge from the current interior. It covered the 2 individuals documented by poll camera footage as likely present on the upper floor. And it covered something that does not always appear in tactical briefing packets for firearms recoveries: the faces of 8 missing persons. Each member of the team had been handed a single printed page with 8 photographs on it. The instruction that accompanied those photographs was explicit. If any team member made physical contact with any person matching those photographs, that individual was to be treated as a victim, not a subject, regardless of what else was happening inside the building at the moment of contact. That turned out to be the most important thing said that morning. There was one complication before the breach. 20 minutes before the planned entry, a monitor watching the poll camera feed saw interior light flicker briefly in a second-floor window. Not a lamp turning on and off, a mobile phone screen moving past glass. Someone was awake on the second floor of a building that was supposed to be empty. The operation commander had 2 options: abort and reassess, potentially losing the element of surprise and the warrant's most favorable window. Or go early. He went early by 11 minutes. The flash bang through the parlor window at 5:52 a.m. was not the scheduled time. It was the adjusted time. 11 minutes of improvisation built into a 4-week operation. The entry team cleared the ground floor and upper floor in under 90 seconds. 2 individuals were detained upstairs. One man in his late 20s found in a rear bedroom, one in his early 30s found on the landing. Both were unarmed at the moment of contact. Both were placed in flex cuffs and walked to the street. Neither offered resistance. The 2 men were separated immediately upon reaching the sidewalk, standard protocol for any multi-subject apprehension, to prevent the coordination of accounts before individual processing. One was walked to a Cleveland PD cruiser, staged at the south end of the block. The other remained on the sidewalk with 2 federal agents, approximately 10 feet from the front stoop. Neither man spoke voluntarily during the initial contact window. The agent handling the street-side subject ran his name through the system on a tablet in the back of a federal vehicle within 4 minutes of cuffing. The name returned a state record: 2 prior arrests, one for receiving stolen property in 2022, and one for unlawful possession of a dangerous ordinance filed in 2023, the latter resolved through a deferred prosecution agreement that required supervised counseling and 6 months of probation check-ins. He had completed both conditions. His file was, technically, clean. But the deferred prosecution agreement had involved a specific type of ordinance, a modified semi-automatic pistol fitted with an illegal auto-conversion device that was, given what the entry team had already begun documenting inside the building, a detail of considerable investigative interest. The name on the second man came back with nothing at all. No priors, no warrants, no history of contact with any law enforcement system at the state or federal level. He was, on paper, a person of entirely clean record who had been found in the pre-dawn hours in an officially vacant building, in proximity to 28 illegal firearms and 8 unlawfully held human beings. The absence of a criminal record, in that context, did not suggest innocence. It suggested that the network organizing this operation had been deliberate about which individuals it exposed to the kinds of tasks that generate police contact and which ones it kept insulated from that exposure. Both men were transported to federal holding for processing within the hour. Neither provided a voluntary statement during the initial booking period. The basement door was steel core, set in a reinforced frame that had not appeared on the 1988 building record. The team used a hydraulic ram. It took 2 strikes. The storage room beyond the basement door was locked with a padlock hasp mounted on the outside, the kind of configuration that only makes sense if the locking is meant to prevent exit, not entry. A bolt cutter took the lock. The door swung inward. 8 adults. 6 young women, ranging in age from 22 to 27. 2 men in their 30s. All 8 were ambulatory. All 8 walked out of the storage room under their own power. The case file would later note that each had been held for 38 days. They were walked up through the basement, through the cleared ground floor, and out the front door onto East 116th Street, where the sky was beginning to pale. Paramedics from 3 Cleveland EMS units were staged on the front lawn. Each of the 8 was assessed on site. All 8 were transported, not in police vehicles, but in 2 vans from a family reunification center operated by a nonprofit organization whose offices were in the Boys and Girls Club building directly across the street. The families who had reported them missing had been quietly notified 2 hours before the breach. They were already waiting. The youngest of the 6 women had been reported missing by her sister in late May of 2026. The sister had called the Cleveland PD non-emergency line at 6 in the evening on a Saturday, filed a missing persons report, and spent the next 5 weeks calling back every few days to ask if anything had changed. The answer was always the same. The case was open. There were no new leads. She had been told, gently, that adult missing persons cases were difficult. That most resolved on their own. That the investigators were doing what they could. What the investigators were doing, in fact, was building a RICO case 4 miles away that was slowly converging on the same address. The 2 investigations, the missing persons report and the gang file, had not been formally linked until Agent Dempsey's team pulled the wire intercept about debt collateral in early July. From that moment, the missing persons cases were reclassified and folded into the federal file. One of the 2 men recovered from the basement had, as best investigators were later able to reconstruct, entered the building voluntarily. He had been brought there on the pretext of a business meeting, a promised introduction to someone who could help him source materials for a small contracting operation he had been trying to build on the side. He was 41 years old. He worked full-time at a distribution warehouse in Maple Heights, had 2 children in school, and had been spending his weekends for 3 years doing handyman and light construction work, trying to save enough to eventually leave the warehouse job behind. His wife had reported him missing 4 days after he disappeared, first to Cleveland PD, then, after 2 weeks of unanswered callbacks, directly to the FBI tip line. Her tip had been logged and assigned a case number. It had not intersected with the Kinsman file before the wire intercept changed the trajectory of the investigation. He had been missing for 31 days before Dempsey's team connected him to the address on East 116th Street. Another of the 6 women had been working a double shift at a restaurant in the Ohio City neighborhood when she was last seen leaving through the employee exit at 2:40 in the morning. Her coworkers reported her absent the following evening when she didn't appear for her next scheduled shift. She was 25 years old, had been in Cleveland for 3 years, and had relocated from Columbus specifically to be closer to extended family. The missing persons report generated a canvas of her 11-block walk home, produced no witnesses and no physical evidence, and had been sitting in an open but inactive status for nearly 3 weeks before the federal reclassification folded it into the East 116th Street file. 38 days of silence, ending on a Wednesday morning at 5:52 a.m. The search of the building took 4 hours after the initial breach. The rooms were cleared methodically, photographed, and cataloged. The evidence log, as it accumulated, was significant by any standard. But nothing in the building compared to what the entry team found in the front parlor. The sergeant, his name is not part of this account, was standing in the parlor after the upper floor had been cleared, waiting for the basement team to signal. He had his baton in his hand, the reflex of someone who moves through uncertain spaces with something to hold. His eyes went to the chimney breast, the way a professional's eyes go to structural anomalies. He stepped forward and tapped the brick column with the baton, once at mid-height. The sound that came back was not the sound of brick. It was a hollow thunk. Light, resonant, the acoustic signature of a plywood panel skinned in reclaimed brick and mortar, pressed to match the surrounding wall. Someone had done skilled finish work to make it look right. In the ambient light of a cluttered parlor at 6 in the morning, it looked right. Tapped with a baton, it gave itself away immediately. The team documented the chimney breast from floor to ceiling. The false facing came off in panels, each one a sheet of 5/8-inch plywood with reclaimed brick set in thinset on the face. Behind the panels, a full-height void running the height of the flue chase, approximately 18 inches deep and 4 feet wide, lined with heavy-gauge steel shelving, bolted to the original brick on 3 sides. The interior was climate-controlled. A small through-wall refrigeration unit, no larger than a hotel minibar compressor, had been recessed into the base of the chase and vented through a modified soffit into the ceiling space. That was the source of the cold. On the shelving, in documented order from the evidence log, 12 semi-automatic pistols, each fitted with an auto-conversion device, federal parlance for a switch, making them fully automatic fire. 9 privately made AR pattern pistols, no serial numbers, each with a short barrel and a folding brace. 4 semi-automatic pistols bearing law enforcement markings from an Akron Police Department equipment room. All 4 were later confirmed stolen from a patrol cruiser storage facility in a burglary that had occurred in the fall of 2025. 3 Draco-style short-barreled rifles, each wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with rubber bands, a detail that suggested they had been packaged for storage rather than immediate deployment. 28 firearms. Hidden behind a fake chimney in a front parlor on East 116th Street. 0 of them legally registered to the LLC, its managing members, or any individual associated with the address. The 4 stolen Akron duty weapons were a separate federal charge layered on top of everything else. Stealing law enforcement firearms from a secure facility is a federal offense independent of what you do with them afterward. Unpopular opinion, and we'll say it plainly, the 9 months between that Akron cruiser burglary and the recovery of those 4 duty weapons represent a serious institutional failure. Law enforcement agencies that lose service weapons from secured facilities and don't trace them to a specific handler or incident create a gap that federal cases later have to close from the criminal end. Those weapons should have generated a sustained federal investigation the moment they went missing. Instead, they showed up in a chimney. The RICO indictment, which had been under seal since late June of 2026 and was now superseded with the new charges from the raid, named 10 defendants. All 10 were in custody by noon on the day of the raid. The arrests had been coordinated to run simultaneously with the entry. 7 additional individuals were picked up at 4 separate addresses in the Kinsman and Glenville neighborhoods within 40 minutes of the breach on East 116th Street. Federal prosecutors described it in a public statement as a coordinated sweep targeting a criminal enterprise that had operated in Cleveland's East Side for several years. The charges were substantial: RICO conspiracy, illegal firearms trafficking, Possession of stolen law enforcement weapons. Obstruction. Unlawful restraint. Federal prosecutors, none of them named in this account, announced the superseding indictment at a press conference that afternoon. The joint operation was described as the product of a multi-month investigation involving the FBI, Cleveland PD, and the ATF. Dennis Farrell's name was not mentioned. Ray Kowalski's name was not mentioned. The beauty supply store and the barbershop owned by the same LLC were both sealed under a federal asset freeze pending civil forfeiture proceedings. The Delaware holding company that sat 2 layers above the LLC was the subject of a separate financial investigation. How far that investigation reaches and what it ultimately surfaces has not yet been made public. Here is what's worth sitting with. The investigators who were building the RICO case were working the right target for 4 months. They had financial anomalies, utility records, wire intercepts. They were getting close. But getting close and having enough to breach a residential structure are different legal thresholds, and the gap between those 2 thresholds was not closed by another month of surveillance. It was closed by a man who pressed his palms against a cold brick wall and asked why. The viewer question that this case really raises is not whether the system worked. It's whether the system would have worked in time. If Ray Kowalski had not gone to that food drive, if Dennis Farrell had been somewhere else that Saturday, the 8 people in that basement had been held for 38 days when the door came off. How many more days was the federal case from reaching the same address on its own? That is a number no one will ever be able to calculate, and that's the part that doesn't sit easily, even now. The evidence collection from the row house continued through the morning and into the afternoon. In addition to the firearms, agents recovered encrypted communications devices, cash in an amount that federal prosecutors declined to specify publicly, and documentation consistent with a larger distribution network extending beyond the East 116th Street address. The encrypted devices, 4 of them, ranging from modified consumer-grade smartphones to what appeared to be a purpose-built encrypted handset of a type more commonly associated with organized crime operations in Eastern European jurisdictions, were bagged, tagged, and transported to the FBI's Cleveland Electronic Surveillance Unit for forensic extraction. Accessing hardened encrypted devices is not the rapid process that television procedurals depict. Federal agents obtained a technical assistance order, but the actual extraction of data from the most secure of the 4 devices was estimated, at the time this account was written, to take between 3 and 6 additional weeks of forensic work. The cash recovered in the building was counted in the field and then independently verified at the Federal Evidence Facility. The total was sufficient, on its own, to constitute a financial element of the RICO conspiracy. The quantity and denomination mix was consistent with proceeds of distribution activity rather than any pattern of personal savings or legitimate commerce. 23% of the bills were in banded stacks, still bearing the paper bands of an armored car delivery service that operates 3 cash handling routes in the greater Cleveland area. Those bands, and the serial sequence of the bills within them, are being traced back through the armored car company's records to identify the financial institution of origin. The poll camera footage of the man with the gray hoodie and the heavy duffel was cross-referenced against the booking photos of the 10 arrested defendants. He was identified. He was the 11th arrest, taken the following morning at an address in Euclid. 11 arrests total. The superseding indictment named 10. The 11th was added under a separate complaint and will likely be folded into the RICO filing at the next scheduled court date. 2 questions from the financial investigation remain open as of the date this account was written. The first, the Delaware Holding Company's capitalization, included a series of transfers from an account in a foreign jurisdiction that federal financial analysts have not yet fully mapped. The second, the LLC's beauty supply store had been operating as a retail business with a merchant account and point-of-sale system. The transaction records for that account show a volume of cash deposits inconsistent with the foot traffic documented in months of street-level observation by the task force. Where that cash originated and what it was moving through the retail account to launder is part of an ongoing investigation that federal prosecutors declined to comment on. The largest single-address firearms recovery on Cleveland's East Side in 11 years. 28 guns. 8 adults recovered from a locked basement. 10, then 11 arrests. A superseding RICO indictment. And somewhere, the financial trail runs into a Delaware incorporation document that points, eventually, to a natural person who has not yet been charged with anything. Will the financial investigation surface that natural person, and will it do so before the statute of limitations becomes a factor? We'd be curious what people who follow federal RICO cases think about that. The financial layer is almost always where these prosecutions either hold or collapse at trial. The Boys and Girls Club van that carried 6 young women and 2 men to the Family Reunification Center on that Wednesday morning made the trip in 14 minutes. Families were waiting in a ground-floor room. A social worker from the nonprofit was present for each reunion. No federal agents were in the room. That was deliberate. The case documentation notes that all 8 adults declined to give formal statements in the first 48 hours. That is standard procedure and standard trauma response. Within 2 weeks, 7 of the 8 had provided voluntary statements to federal prosecutors. The 8th exercised the right to decline. Federal prosecutors indicated that the 7 statements were sufficient for the charges filed. The row house on East 116th Street is now under a court preservation order. It cannot be sold, rented, or modified while the civil forfeiture case is pending. The false chimney breast is gone, removed as evidence and cataloged. What remains is the flue chase in the original brick, open now, just a vertical void in the corner of a parlor where someone once built a very convincing lie. Ray Kowalski is no longer renting the room. He moved back to his sister's house in Parma in late July, closer to the Union Hall. His name is on no federal document in this case. He will not receive any portion of the forfeiture proceeds. He is not a protected witness and did not request any protective designation. He pressed his palms against a cold brick and told someone about it. That is the full extent of what he did. And it was enough. The RICO case is now in pre-trial proceedings. Sentencing, if convictions are obtained, is likely to be measured in decades for the primary defendants. The firearms charges alone carry mandatory federal minimums that stack. But the Delaware holding company is still incorporated. The merchant account transaction records are still being analyzed. The network that ran through one building on one street in one Cleveland neighborhood was larger than one building, one street, or one neighborhood. The chimney is gone. The question of where the money went is